So when you look out at the world now, who is it looking, if not personality?
Life.
So life is looking at the world through you. Who is the you there?
Well, on the absolute level, there isn't a you, but there is a real appearance of a you.
Okay. Can you describe this being entity? This is this appearance of you. And what's it sensing in the world around you right now, right where you are, where you're sitting? What is your impression? What's happening?
I can feel cold coming from the window here. It's a very cold day.
Okay.
I can feel cold on my leg. I'm looking at you.
What do you think about the room, or about? Do you have any emotional events? Is Jez looking at this stuff, or is this Jez's place?
Well, yeah, in the story of Jez, this is Jez's house.
Okay.
Outside of that story, I'm a character who comes in and owns the house for a few years and dies, and then nobody, then someone else takes over. You know, when you think about it, there's been many owners of this house. It's quite an old house, and I'm just one in a line. I'm saying that to indicate that I suppose it's an angle on one's life that if you think of your life, there's two ways of looking at this. Okay, there's one way where you look at the beginning, the first man, and you look at 2020, and you have that time frame, and the little kind of highlighted with your marker pen bit that's your life at the end of the 20th century, whatever, is tiny, right? So on one hand, there's the acknowledgement of that, which certainly gives an incredible wonder and respect that it happens at all. But we're talking about something different, I think, not just that level. We're talking about that there is an acknowledgement and a seeing that there is actually no Jez ultimately.
So was to actually my next question. What feeling of self is there, if any? So there isn't much of a feeling of self.
There is.
There is.
Well, self.
Right.
There's self and there's personality, and there's big difference, and obviously that really underpins everything I talk about. So the way I see it is the personality, like we all need a self. We can't function in this world without the self. There is nothing wrong with having a self. This is how life works. It's part of nature. It's wonderful. So the self is the idea that I am this being and I am this body and I can operate in this way and say this to you and this is my name and that's your name and I can pick up this by doing that. So the self is absolutely necessary. So any idea that one extinguishes the self the functioning of the self to me is insane, right? So let's get that straight. The personality, and this is why I talk personality about it a lot, is the way I see it is like it's the false self. It's what that natural functioning sense of self becomes in life by identifying as only that self, that is who one is. And that self accrues and gathers a story, emotions, mostly from beginning at the wound, what I call the wound, and needs and strategies and all these sort of things that coalesce into this thing called personality. So there's two things going on. There's one, aligning oneself with I am the self, which is a natural thing that we do that ends when you wake up, I would say. But then there's aligning to what the self becomes, which is the personality. So what happened to me was about realizing two things, really. A, I'm not the personality. I'm not this thing that the self became with all its fucked upness and its patterns and its emotions and its heartache and everything. But also, ultimately I'm not even the self, let alone the full self. And it's very, very hard to talk about this, and one starts sounding like some non-duality nut job. But the bottom line of waking up is realizing that.
That was very close to what my next question was how do you internally distinguish your current natural state from your former personality-based state? And I think that's what you just said. And is there a way that you can tell um, that this is different somehow when you're trying to explain it to somebody? How can you tell if you are in your natural state or if you're still somehow operating through the personality that may believe that it's awake?
I mean, it's tricky with the phrase the natural state because what I mean by that is the best way to look at it is a newborn baby is in the natural state. This is a state of being that is present before the personality forms.
Yes.
So, what I'm saying is that it is possible to live as an adult with that as the main thing informing your life and the way you live. Therefore, the things that form the personality are not informing constantly your everyday life. They may arise, but because isn't identification with that personality, they are not running the show anymore.
So you
So,
see them, but you don't identify with them. You don't think they are completely real. They more or less they can pass on by without, let's say, catching you in their net. Would that
yes,
be?
yes, but also because the identification with personality has been broken, it diminishes to a very large extent the life of the personality. Because I always put it like, because the vine is cut and it stops growing, it stops having a life force. There is some life force left in it because there's a history and there's a kind of energy kind of keeps going forward to a certain extent until it's resolved. And this is not to say that it has to be resolved for you to be free. It's just that what comes up, but it's seen from a very different place. So therefore, a very good example of this is if somebody insults you, you've just told me about someone who kind of made a comment about me or my work. And now if I went into reactivity about that, that would be my personality. That would be saying, that would be that part of me that needs to be on top, that needs to feel I'm right and they're wrong, and needs to defend itself, to prove itself strong and intact. So reactivity is very much part of personality. So one thing that goes really is that kind of reactivity. Even if it did arise, because personality, memory of personality in this system can arise, I would say it would be seen through in a split second for what it is. And it would almost be laughed at because it's like, God, I mean, once you see the personality, it almost becomes funny because it's this entity that wants to run the show, wants to be thought of as like this or like that, and it becomes almost laughable once you've seen through it.
That reminds me, there was a state of consciousness which I have very rarely experienced. It's not exactly the same as what we call the awakened state, which is quite clear, in which you see ordinary people in their personality clothing, if you will, and they become almost like cartoon characters. And it's like you're not really looking at real life anymore. You're looking at an entire cartoon universe where all these people are in this delusion, and it is quite weirdly funny.
Yeah, it can be, but there's also another angle where you know that the personality, the identification with the personality is what causes what I call personality suffering. So there's also compassion too. So I don't want to be glib about it. I mean, I know,
No, this is what I was trying to say is that this funny kind of world exists as a particular state of consciousness, but it's not one that you want to dwell in because the element there of compassion and understanding in that state is gone. So you're just seeing the cartoonish aspect of it, like with a particular kind of sunglasses, if you will, with a particular tint.
Yeah, but so it's not just that, it's the ability to see that. It's but it's also the ability, not the ability, but the arising of compassion for that. That seems to be a very human thing that is part of this too.
I think that's probably the most important, or one of the most important things, is that when you see it, it can appear in different phases, but understanding it then develops compassion for
Yeah,
the reality of where the person actually is without
absolutely.
putting
This
them
is not
down.
about being aloof in any
No,
way.
that's very important that we don't get into this. And I think this is a big danger in this movement, this non-dual movement, for example, is there is an implied superiority with these people sitting on the stage and pontificating about their wonderful understanding of the way the universe works.
Yesterday, on this subject of compassion, I mean, yesterday I had my kind of weekly online group, and somebody went into a very strong emotional reaction of pain and tears, and I'm just talking. I felt this teardrop running down my cheek, and it's just empathy, human empathy. Yeah, but you just mentioned superiority. See, for me, we talked a little bit about this. There are certain tells that show that point to personality being present and running the show. Okay, so any sense of superiority would be one of those tells.
Yes. I mean, we all know that some people are more talented than others. Others have particular skills that we may have, but within the larger sense, that's where we can say we are. Nobody is really superior that way. We're all at different stages of evolution, but within a common kind of being.
Well, you may be a better speaker than someone or a better artist in some way, but you don't need to feel superior about it. You wouldn't
Right.
hide it either. I mean, that's also personality. If you're kind of hiding, using biblical terms, hiding your light under a bushel,
Uh,
that's not this either, because this is the celebration of all that you are, all that appears to be what you are. But you see, there's the vital point is that there can be no claiming of it.
right. Because
And
that would
there's no
be
claiming of it because of what I said at the beginning, that what the seeing through that I'm doing this. Therefore, the idea of claiming any of it is finished, absolutely finished.
well, this is, of course, the difference between, let's just say, for an example, which I use quite often, is the racing driver. The racing driver, when he's in the state, which is an altered state, a higher level, if you will, of consciousness, is fantastic. And the problem comes after the race is over, when he claims superiority because of what he did. That's dropping back down into personality.
Yeah,
But the
exactly.
personality can't really exist in the moment in the race.
Yeah,
Because if it does, we see it happen sometimes. It happened yesterday, for example. Uh, uh, Leclerc got ahead of himself. He pushed. There was a crash. He knocked himself out and somebody else, because personality interfered with the clarity of the awakened state that you need in order to drive at in that situation.
hmm
And my next question, which you actually started to answer already, you stress full engagement in the moment in any endeavor. I think that's one of the points I liked uh, in your glossary. And this is the same thing as in Zen or what Gurdjieff spoke about. What do you think about, or any doer? This question of if they're a doer, or if someone says it's life doing it through you. Do you have some kind of comment on that?
Well, only that, it goes back to what I've just said about you can't claim anything. And when you can't claim anything, ultimately there's no doer. But there appears to be a doer.
Okay.
I
Now,
mean, yeah, go on.
go ahead, finish your thought if you had it.
Well, I was just going to say that the way I talk about it is that this is the balance between the absolute and the relative. You know, the absolute part is knowing that there is no doer, there is no choice, that jazz doesn't even exist in one sense. The relative part is the consciousness of this relative level and the appearance of jazz and whatever talents jazz has, and the living out of that, the feeling of that, the enjoyment of that, the celebration of that. So to me, that's the balance of the two. It's not an intellectual balance, it's just how it is.
Okay. Now, one of the things that a lot of people talk about in this field, let's say, is that mind should be silent. And I have a lot of people who know a lot of people that spend a lot of time trying to be silent, and it becomes actually they become very antagonistic to thinking itself and everything. And sometimes it seems if they don't get it right, they become sort of like zombies. And is your mind normally silent? And will you think about things only when it's necessary to accomplish a particular task or objective, or do thoughts run through your mind that you just observe and let go?
Well, I think on this subject, you know, I have to bring this back to personality. So if personality is in the driving seat of your life, then thoughts will be generated from personality and its needs and its strategies and its emotions. So, for example, there will be thoughts of superiority, there will be thoughts of jealousy, there will be thoughts of trying to control and a mania around that, maybe. So, there's a kind of thought that arises from personality. So, in being unhooked from personality, those kind of thoughts just get turned way down and generally kind of once again die on the vine. So, but the idea that there's anything wrong with thinking, you know, there's nothing wrong with that kind of thinking, but it's a suffering kind of thinking because it comes from the stress and the needs of the personality, and it's full of tension, and it's coming from the idea that I'm not good enough and I'm not happy as I am. So that kind of thought is one thing, but to malign all thought because of that area of thought is a total misnomer as far as I'm concerned. What's wrong with thinking? Thinking is part of the natural state of an adult. It's part of our. It's an amazing thing.
Okay, and that seems something I could agree with. Yeah, that's also what I've tried to express without necessarily a great deal of success. Now, I presume you often have the feeling of awe, or you mentioned it before, actually, already. It's kind of an incredible thing just to be here in this whatever this is, and in conjunction with that, many people have what they call transcendental experiences. I mean, really, sort of things like out of body or samadhi experiences, real high levels, strikingly different things. Do you have these on occasion, blissful kind of experiences, or something that's outside of your normal kind of awakened being perception?
Well, my take on this would be that identified with personality and the suffering of it, to experience anything beyond that, to have an experience beyond personality, is in itself, by contrast, an incredible thing. Because suddenly you're lifted out of that world of suffering, whether it's mental obsession or putting oneself down or jealousy or whatever it is. You're suddenly immediately in a different place where all of those things don't apply. So therefore, by contrast, that experience is transcendent because it's transcending personality, but it's an amazing contrast. So, like, I don't have the full answer to this, by the way, but this is all I can say at this moment. That once identification with my personality dropped, the kind of openings that I had, which were incredibly not just transcendent, but blissful in a way because of that relief from the suffering of personality. They kind of stopped happening because the difference is not there. It's almost like the ongoing experience is to be outside of that kind of suffering anyway. So there's no kind of big difference. This is not to say I'm in constant bliss all the time. That's not true. But I would say there is that awe that you spoke about is pretty much around most of the time. Yeah, I would say that. There are moments. Yeah, don't really know what else to say on that.
You say in your glossary about being that there are 4 components of being. I think they were joy, stillness, choiceless awareness, and full engagement with life. Can you comment briefly on these 4 points and how you know or feel that they are the components of being?
Simply by observation, really. Observation. I mean, I feel this thing happened to me, this shift happened to me, and all I'm doing in my online group and in sessions and talking with you is reflecting on that and on finding out on what it is. And, you know, if you go to a new country to find out how the country ticks and what it's about, you have to walk the land and talk to the people and experience it. And I feel ever since it happened to me that that's what I'm doing. I don't know everything about this. I don't know how it all works, but I know I'm simply walking around observing what it is, how it responds, for example, to your questions. And one of these 4 things were observations I made about I saw about the natural state. So we could go through them. Fulfilling engagement. I mean, I understand people can say, oh, you've just kind of made a system, right? And I think maybe some people kind of balk at that and find it mental or something, or I don't know. But I don't have a problem with maps. You know, maps for me are really important and they can convey information very clearly. I mean, I'm a graphic designer and illustrator, so I see things very visually as well as verbally. And I have found maps very helpful. In fact, in my story of waking up, if you want to call it that, I often wrote maps. As I understood things, I get it down on paper, and this is here and that led to that, and this is how that happened. So I've got a whole bunch of these things that I mean, I don't need them now, but at the time they really helped me understand what was happening. And really, I guess my book came out of that kind of thinking. I like seeing the map of how this works. Now, I have to be very clear, and I've said this before, that there are things about this that you can see and you can understand. And you can walk that far, and then there's a drop-off point, and then you enter the full mystery of it, and you can't talk about it. Earlier on, when you talked about there being no one there, and we were discussing that, I'm very aware when we talk about that. I don't usually talk about that because although it's true, it's so difficult to talk about and almost impossible. And everything you say sounds not quite right. So I try and avoid usually talking about that. But there is an area of this, the psychological perhaps area, the landscape of what it takes to wake up in a human life that can, I feel, be discussed, and that's what I mostly do. So part of that for me was identifying, how can you know what this is without identifying? How can you find it without identifying what it is? And this is why I often use the example of a baby. You could try and talk about being what it is for weeks on end and never get over what it is. But if you look at a baby, you experience what it is. And everybody has been a baby, everyone has been with babies. And if I wanted to describe to you what I mean by being, I would say look at a newborn baby, boom, it's there. So it's really hard to describe, but there is a peace, there's a stillness there. I mean, I know babies can be loud and crying and everything, but at essence, there is a stillness there that is there before those things. There is a still mind, but there would be because the mind hasn't developed yet. So that's not kind of relevant at that stage. There is certainly full feeling engagement with life. What I mean by that is whatever is brought into the baby's sphere of influence and experience, it experiences fully and it interacts with fully. If there's a taste it likes, it will eat it. If it doesn't like it, it will spit it out. It's fully engaged. It doesn't yet have the ability to, well, I kind of contradict myself slightly there, but there is a choiceless awareness because it can't yet choose, I like this and I don't like that. The body can choose, right? The body can say, I don't like that taste. But there's no mind, there's no personality saying, I like that person, I like mummy, but I don't like daddy. So that's a very bold kind of a description of what choiceless awareness starts out as. But that choiceless awareness is part of what appears in after waking up. In that, the preferences and likes and dislikes, which naturally appear in a self, are still there. But the likes and dislikes and the reactions and the reactivity that come from personality, which is a different thing, don't run the show. They don't tell you how to act anymore.
Well, I think this analogy with the baby is extremely important. In your work, you usually are working with your intellectual center as you describe certain things. But then there are other centers that are involved. And it seems to me, especially the emotional center comes, for example, with music particularly, or with this observation of the baby in its pure state. It's not an intellectual reaction to the way the baby is. The baby is this pure kind of open being. And you're right, it's clear. You look at him, you see a little Buddha there, if you're into that kind of stuff. And then the Buddha gradually disappears as personality takes over. And the theory that I'm most familiar with, at some point, you've acquired this personality, and then you have to kind of mature it and get rid of it and come back to being like the baby, but with a kind of wisdom and knowledge and experience that the baby didn't have, because the baby can't survive on its own. Mm-hmm. So you have these skills, but you also develop the personality part, which is in most cases identifying completely with the personality rather than with the larger sort of being or self, if you will. So that's, I think, a very, very important point. Now, I was thinking about the awakened state that I assume you're in. Do you recognize that there are different levels of it in your own life? Let's say a difference between where you are right now and how you might be, let's say, with your partner in an intimate situation, or with music. Can you kind of dissolve into the music and feel a much more emotional, in other words, the emotional center much more active, or the movement center in dancing and so on, so that there are different levels of the awakened state. It's not just an intellectual apperception.
Well, I wouldn't call it a level. I would say that whatever it's doing is what it, like I said, fulfilling engagement with life. So if I'm making music, I'm fully engaged in that. If I'm with my wife, I'm fully engaged with that. So whatever is happening is what's happening at that time. So it's not really like a different level. It's the same choiceless awareness applied to this part of a song and how I'm playing it, and if I'm in time, or I'm talking to my wife about something and what is she trying to say and can I understand it clearly, and or talking to you. So it's the same thing applied in different areas, I would say. That's the oneness, really. I would say that's what I'm saying, that the choiceless awareness is It's not something that changes. You know, personality awareness, as I call it, is coming from personality, and it starts to say, I'm not going to look at that because that's threatening to me, and I'll look away from that, and I'll have an image of myself like this because that makes me feel safer. So all of that stuff goes out the window. If whatever is seen from outside of that editing process, and the same thing is applied whatever you're doing.
So if you're cooking, for example,
Yeah, I
uh,
cooked yesterday. I cooked 3 soups yesterday.
so you get really you like cooking, you enjoy smells, colors, so on, and you become, hopefully, I do that too, fully engaged with the
Yeah.
process of
Oh yeah.
cooking and
I love it.
appreciating it. And I find it quite cool. The fact that everything is slightly different and how much variety there actually is in this apparent world. You know,
Mm.
whether it's a carrot or a broth or anything.
I also like doing that sort of thing because they do use different parts of this being, you know, and when I'm cooking a soup, I'm not using my brain, my mental side so much as I am now. And I like that very much.
Well,
You know,
that's what, yes, this is what I was talking to earlier about, is involving other centers,
yeah,
because there are a couple of other centers are involved. You
yeah.
have an emotional center involved. You have a little bit of intellectual. Maybe you have to read a recipe, but you have the touching comes from the
I don't use recipes.
sensations, the smells, all this kind of stuff, right?
Feel of how much to put in. You enter the flow of cooking, and that's why I really like recipes. I will use them if I need to do something new, but basically I'm refining soups that I know, and it's a flow of like, oh, how much do you put in, how do you want to cut it, is that too much of this, and it's just disappearing into that flow, and it's an act of creation. And when I'm making music, it's entering that flow, which is a different part of me, and it's a lovely break from the rest. It's because it's very different. It's not words. That's why it's very different, because I'm not using words. Well, I am in the lyrics, but mostly I'm playing. Um, so for me, a balance is doing those different things. If I just talked about this all the time, that would be insane. That would be like a fish. I've used this before, but it's like a fish swimming in the sea. Just keep saying, I'm wet, I'm wet. You know, it's like you don't say that, you just swim.
Well, I think this is a real problem with a lot of the online stuff, the social media stuff, and these various forums online, is that people are intellectually talking about something, and I don't get the feeling that they're actually living in it, but they're talking about it, and it's a purely intellectual. I know this consciousness is only that, and I don't really exist. I mean, utter, in my mind, utter fucking lower intellectual centered nonsense, and that's really quite a shame because it narrows everything down to personalities discussing how much they know and compared to somebody else. And so I think that is a real issue in the internet, especially, and that people don't really live lives. They talk about it.
Yeah, it's a
Another
very
thing that's
different thing.
interesting is time. Sorry to interrupt you there,
I was
but
just going to say those are very different things. You can live it and talk about it to a limited extent, or you can just talk about it without living it. If you live it, then when you talk about it, it comes from a different place. It's just from experience. And somebody might say, oh, that's what so and so said. It's like, oh, is it? You know, I found out, as I was telling you earlier, that Gurdjieff talked about personality in a similar way that I do. And that was just, I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me because I don't know why more people don't see this, you know.
they don't. They don't want to. Sorry, there's some part of them doesn't want to see it.
Absolutely not.
One of the one of the most important things that I have had experience with is that the more awake you are, time starts to change. Time ceases to exist in the awakened state. Do you have that experience too when you're fully engaged with something, that the sense of time passing almost vanishes?
Yeah, I think, you don't have to be awake to experience that. Anybody who's fully engaged in something knows that feeling, I think.
And that would be, for in that moment, perhaps them being awake in a way, because full engagement, you can't be thinking about it necessarily with the personality because you've forgotten the personality while you're doing some task, so that people do have awakened moments without
Yeah.
necessarily understanding that's what they are.
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I would say they're little moments beyond personality. It's a kind of more awakening has a lot of weight to it. So I would say they are moments where they're penetrated beyond the influence of personality because they're so engaged in that moment. And like you say, that mental chatter or whatever just kind of goes into the background for a moment. But the main thing I'm saying is that, and not everybody agrees with this, is that engagement as personality in the background that always comes back can end. That's the main thing I'm saying. I'm only saying it because it's my experience. I didn't know it could be true, uh, but that's the only reason I'm talking about it.
There's sometimes a lot of people talk in terms of ethics and morality and so on. It would seem to me that there would be a different approach to both ethics and morality in the awakened state than in the opinions of the personality or judgments or dogma. Is that your experience as well?
I would say on a very basic level, there is a reverence for life. And out of that reverence and the seeing that, in a sense, on the absolute level, we're all one, we're just all atoms arranged in the form of this being. The the reverence for that and the awe, you talked earlier about awe, it means that the idea of violence, the kind of violence that comes from personality, obviously, would be unthinkable because there's nothing in you that the, the okay, how do I put it? Trying to avoid certain words which will get us into different, like I'm trying to avoid the word love because that's a whole nother subject. But that reverence means that you have respect for life and you have respect for other beings. You have absolute respect for the way one self has been created, and in the same way you have that for other people. Now the personality has all sorts of objectives and strategies and reasons for sometimes turning against other people and even hating them because they threaten them or whatever. They show things up in them that they don't want to see. So you can imagine with all that gone, you just see different configurations of people, but they're not a threat to you like they were before. And there's a respect for them. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, of course. I mean, I don't agree with Trump, but this is a manifestation of life. Um, I've forgotten what the question was now. Was it about violence?
Well, it wasn't actually, it was about ethics and morality, but uh, I think violence, of course, is a big part of it because violence, in my mind, violence is on occasion necessary, let's say, for a survival thing, or in
Yeah,
the earlier days as a matter of gathering food. But the violence today, which is institutional violence, trillions of dollars every year, war machines going on as if we haven't learned anything, which we haven't apparently at all, and all of this one-upsmanship and power plays and so on and so forth. All of that are aspects of personality where violence has gotten to a stage of importance that it's completely beyond its original necessity.
yeah. I
Uh,
mean, one thing's for sure, if everyone in the world, there'll be no wars.
that's that's absolutely true. I,
Yeah,
I think that's absolutely true
yeah.
because they never really seem to solve anything, or very
And,
rarely.
right. And this is why people who like to believe of peace on earth, lovely idea, right? But as long as people are still identifying with personalities and they don't wake up, that's never going to happen. So I don't have any kind of alignment with that kind of thinking because I'm a realist. There is a realism to this, which comes from seeing life as it is. And when I look at the world, I see that most people on the planet have absolutely no interest in this, and that is how it is. So I don't feel it's my job to change that, because that's how it is. Although, having said that, in my limited, very limited sphere, I do feel to share this. That's the way I'm made, that's my creativity, that's the use of my talents, whatever. So I do feel to do that. But I do it without an overlay of, I'm going to save the world, I'm going to save this person, blah, blah, blah. Now, if somebody through me talking remembers what this is, because we all know it somewhere for themselves, then of course I'm happy. And I've seen that happen with one person, and there's little intimations of maybe it's going to happen with others, but that's almost secondary. I'm simply engaging fully in the relative level as this being, living its talents and sharing what it feels to share.